everything that happened along this way was totally unexpected. Like I wasn't expecting to go get a master's in philosophy, and halfway through I was like, why in the world am I doing this? Because I actually wound up being a little bit frustrated with analytic philosophy, because and most of us in the program we thought we were going to go and study the cool questions, but I remember I had a professor who said, well, I tried to read Kierkegaard, completely meaningless, doesn't even make a lick of sense, and I was like, what? I thought you were the teacher.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. Today on the Yours Truly podcast, I have Justin Wells in the virtual studio. Justin is a filmmaker, film educator, and specializes in documentary. I bumped into Justin meandering around this little corner of the internet. I think he was in a stream with Cassidy Vanderkamp, another film specialist here in the corner. I can't quite remember. But when I stumbled onto his channel, what I found was a meaning crisis treasure chest filled with his philosophical musings and tools for extracting philosophical meta-meaning and truth from film via his frameworks of the 7 basic plots and documentary as a spiritual journey. More recently, he has begun to hone in on Monsterology. He is the author of a book entitled How to Film Truth, the story of documentary film as a spiritual journey. You can find all of this on his YouTube channel, Justin's Morning Coffee, and his book is available on Amazon. We'll get into all of this and more here on the Yours Truly podcast. Justin.
Hey, Christian.
Hey, man. So here we are. Yeah, man, I came across your stuff, and I've always loved film. It's played at least as big a role in my life as books. Being born in 1985, I feel like dumped into the Spielberg Lucas world, and so I really resonated with what you're doing on your channel, and so I reached out to see if we could have a conversation about all of that here in this meaning space. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
So like one of the first things I noticed as I was kind of digging in, doing some research, was kind of you took a first principles journey to getting to where you're at. And I'm kind of curious, like, what came first? Did you want to do film, or within your undergrad you had like philosophy and then art and theology? So how did you get into that mindset?
Yeah, what do you mean by first principles journey?
So you didn't go get your undergrad in filmmaking?
Oh, well, I did. I was communications with a film emphasis in undergrad.
Okay, I thought I read that you were got a philosophy under.
That was my first master's.
Okay, all right. So I guess I got that confused.
Yeah. So well, I'll tell you though. I think I know what you're saying. So I was, I grew up Christian, evangelical, went to an evangelical college, majored in communications with an emphasis in film. And I was really, I'm sorry about that. I was really a photographer, a still photographer in high school. I got really into cameras and stuff. And then I joined the film business working for, sorry about this.
That's all right. If you watch a lot of my videos, I've got a lot of throat clearing in my videos.
It's like a cough button you need. So I was into cameras, and I got my first job at Panavision, right out of undergrad, Panavision International, joined the film business, got into the union as a camera guy. And how it sort of happened was across the street, I don't know why I'm coughing so much. There's a little junior college called Pierce College across the street from Panavision where I worked. And I was getting kind of bored with lack of intellectual stimulation, you might say. And I was probably 23, 24. And I would go across the street and during my lunch hour and walk around the campus, this junior college. And I saw a philosophy and film class being taught at night. in their catalog. Like their catalog was just like out one day when it was like preview day or something. I happened to be there, and I went, you know what? I'm going to take that class. I'm going to take that philosophy and film class. And the guy who taught it was a co-writer of The Godfather Part 2. So the whole class was just him talking about The Godfather Part 2. Yeah, that's what you get a lot of people.
Industry,
you know, they have the one thing that they did and they talk about it the whole time, you know. And so I was like, wow, that really like scratched an itch for me, you know. And I was like, I am happy to have my career, but I started to, at that point, differentiate, you might say, between paycheck and passion, you know? So where it's like I was developing and cultivating a skill that is in high demand, which is a digital camera technician, which is still my day job.
Okay.
But then my passion was this the more intellectual side. And so I just wanted more after that. So I looked and I found UCLA Extension. UCLA Extension had these classes. And so I would drive down to UCLA, a beautiful campus, and it was a lot of retired guys, like retired teachers and even doctors and stuff that would take these night classes at the UCLA Extension, because you didn't have to be enrolled in UCLA to do it, but they were still taught by UCLA PhDs in philosophy.
Oh, wow.
So I remember I took a class on mythology, which was a young class. I took existentialism. I took philosophy of religion. I took Kierkegaard. I took Sartre. You know, I took all of this stuff. And kind of what I was doing, I think, was saying, okay, the faith that was passed down to me, let's put it to the test. Let's go right. Let's just read the most intelligent, smart people in the world that have ever written anything, and let's see, you know. And one day, one of the teachers there said, yeah, I've seen you around a lot, you know. You probably have enough prerequisites that you could probably get a master's in philosophy. And at the time, I had left Panavision and I was working on a show called Reno 911.
Oh, yeah.
And for me, that show was just terrible experience, because we were out in the desert all the time, and it was just so silly. And I just thought, is this really what my legacy is going to be? Like making something that comes on Comedy Central at 11 o'clock at night, you know, that people can just, you know, get high and watch or something like that. That's like what I was sort of, and I said, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go back. I'm going to get this philosophy degree. And it was just like, I felt I needed to do it. So I wound up, he goes, I teach at Cal State Long Beach. So why don't you get a master's there? And I was like, well, that sounds easy. I'll do that. You know, so while I was working, I started getting this master's degree. And weirdly enough, I wrote my master's thesis on the meaning of life, using Albert Camus' notion of the absurd and Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher from the 1980s that kind of like updated it. And I was actually just reading that thesis a while back, and I thought, wow, it's even back then nobody thought that was a legitimate topic in philosophy. They said, no, that's a category mistake. A sign can have meaning, but it's meaningless to say a life has meaning. You have to argue for that. You know, that was like the first part of the thesis. I had to argue for why it's okay to talk about meaning as a legitimate philosophy subject, you know?
Wow. That's almost crazy.
But that was right in the middle of the peak of new atheism, I would say, you know?
Yeah.
And so most of my classmates were super into that stuff. They were super into the new atheist stuff. And I was this kind of weird outlier to them, you know?
Yeah, meat sacks, no meaning.
Yeah, right. I remember we had a teaching philosophy class, and one of my classmates gave his lecture, and his lecture was a narrative, basically. He thought, this is how I would teach philosophy. First, man was religious. Now we've you know, thrown all that away, and the whole story of philosophy is the process of throwing those superstitions away from Plato on up to the modern day. And the more superstitions they threw away, the better it was. And what I thought was actually kind of cool was that he had gone so far in that direction that the whole class pushed back against him.
Wow.
And said, no, that you're, you know. So it was a lively debate, I guess you could say. But for me, it was just like getting thrown right in the thick of things, you know, like nobody is going to give me any like point for what what I already believe, like in Christian circles where everybody kind of assumes the same thing. None of that, and just kind of like fend for myself. And I enjoyed it, and so I got my degree in philosophy. I know I'm going a little long with the story.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I got my degree in philosophy, then I went on to do theology, and then my MFA in art. So I kind of went overboard on the education. And the whole time I was working in film, and doing film on the side. And so now I'm at a place where I'm on the other side of those degrees and teaching a little bit, and still working in film and doing my projects on the side.
Yeah. So there's several things there. So you said you kind of put your faith to the test reading, I guess in those kind of audit classes that you were doing, or I don't know, I guess you were getting credit for them, but that's where you were really introducing yourself to the big philosophers. And was that kind of your crucible for your faith? Is that what you're kind of saying as far as like, and then when you go into that master's program, you're like surrounded by the intensity of the new atheism in the culture, and that got to play out. But it was interesting that classmate of yours was being so honest, it seems like, with his authentic to the telos of that. That's, you don't find that a lot, actually. I think, oh no, there is meaning, we can make, it sounds like he was actually pushing against that. So
Yeah.
that was really, really fascinating to find one of those out in the wild. And, so that, and then I think you said, or I saw that you got your, that education, theological education from Fuller.
Yeah.
I had some, went there.
It was a weird it was, again, like this whole everything that happened along this way was totally unexpected. Like I wasn't expecting to go get a master's in philosophy, and halfway through I was like, why in the world am I doing this? Because I actually wound up being a little bit frustrated with analytic philosophy, because and most of us in the program we thought we were going to go and study the cool questions, but I remember I had a professor who said, well, I tried to read Kierkegaard, completely meaningless, doesn't even make a lick of sense, and I was like, what? I thought you were the teacher, but I didn't know at the time that there was a divide between analytic and continental philosophy. So they didn't read those guys. They don't read Kierkegaard. They didn't read Nietzsche that much. They would read them as kind of like novelties almost, and do, here, let's do a fun class. We'll do an elective on, but so I was kind of frustrated, and I was like, I don't know. Maybe this was all a mistake. I don't know if I got anything out of it, except for like the exercise, the intellectual exercising.
Yeah, the discipline of it, the training of that. Yeah, that is different from, you can listen to a lecture about those things here on YouTube, but to be tested on it and to be forced to write on it and to read on it, that does, that's a different type of education, and I think that's important.
Yeah. So no, it was good. It was good. But then I just to tell you how I got to Fuller, we were going to go to the Sundance Film Festival, and I happened to hop in a van with a bunch of students that some of them were from Fuller and some of them were from Biola. Biola had just started this film program where I now teach. And we drove all the way to Utah from LA. And in this van, there were a couple of guys from Fuller, and they were having conversations that was like, that's what I wanted to be talking about when I was doing my philosophy degree. And I realized that, weirdly enough, the theologians had a better handle on the type of philosophy that I wanted to study. And so I immediately started commuting from Long Beach up to Pasadena to start doing classes in theology and art from Fuller Theological Seminary.
Okay, so now you said you kind of still working a day job, and then you're also teaching, and but all this has been cooking for years now, and it seems like, was that what prompted you to start your channel and to kind of get some of this like formulated out, and then writing the book as well?
Yeah. So what wound up happening was, I while I was at Fuller, I was pretty much involved any conversation that had to do with the intersection of people of faith and artists, I was sort of involved with it or there, you know. So we had the Windwriter Forum at Sundance, which is dialogues between people of faith and filmmakers. There was the International Arts Movement Conference, which was in New York, which was really the fine art thing run by Mako Fujimura, a Japanese fine artist. And then I went over to Theology, the Institute for Theology, Imagination, and the Arts in St. Andrews, Scotland, for a conference, and I was able to finagle so I could take one class with them, one directed reading with one of their professors. So it's kind of like around all of these conversations, and I just started to notice that, like, if for a someone who wanted to do film and they were a person of faith, what tools do you have available to you? And most of those tools in, let's say, writing or figuring out how to do a story, a narrative, were coming from this genre of book that I call kind of like the screenwriting self-help book. It's kind of like takes the format of a self-help book, but it's a screenwriting book. So it's like the writer's journey, which is based off of of Joseph Campbell, and the monomyth, you know. And so there's this kind of real sense of going from Jung to Campbell to Christopher Vogler, George Lucas and Christopher Vogler, to create this theory of how a story works. But what I found was, in talking to actual screenwriters and stuff, was that they kind of put that at a distance. It's like, oh yeah, kind of, but they go a little bit more on instinct, perhaps, or intuition, maybe. So they wouldn't follow the hero's journey exactly, but they would kind of use it as a guide a little bit. But I didn't really. I found it unsatisfying somehow, and so I wanted to say, well, I would rather do a little bit more justice to the biblical stories, because I think the heroes, Joseph Campbell doesn't really take them seriously, not in terms of believing them, but in terms of their structure, you know. And so I wanted to do something that I said, I'm going to start exploring the archetypal stories and try to go a little bit beyond Joseph Campbell to scratch the itch that I was just feeling like there was a lack in the way that we were thinking about story in all of these screenwriting seminars that I've been to, and, you know, conversations I've had about story and script over the years. And so it was really just thinking out loud. Paul Vanderklay, of course, was the one who gave me the almost permission to think out loud on a channel, you know, and kind of like, yeah, he's doing it, I could probably, you know, do something in my world that way. And so that's how it started.
Place we go. Are you getting an echo?
No, I'm not getting an echo.
So what was the timeline on where were you at in that? What year was that starting to bubble?
Well, I think I found Paul's channel. I found in maybe early 2021 or late 2020.
Okay.
It was during the pandemic. What I was doing during the pandemic was, there was this little cafe downstairs from where I live here in Pasadena, and it was one of the only ones that had like outside table. And so you could sit outside, and it became kind of like my one little place I could go to for a little bit of community, because there was these musicians that would play guitar over on the stoop, the stair step over here. And then there was a couple of other regulars that would sit outside in this one cafe. And since nothing else was going on, I started to take all of the books that I never could get through and sitting at that cafe and reading them. So I read Charles Taylor for the first time.
Okay, yeah.
I read McIntyre for the first time. And I kind of started this little habit of reading at this cafe. But it was a kind of a solo intellectual journey. And I don't know how I found Paul's channel. I don't know if I found him on Twitter first or YouTube first, but I just thought he was talking about something deeper than what everyone else was talking about, which was all of the, you know, social unrest and political rivalries and, you know, everything, all of the sort of like rifts in society that were magnified by the pandemic. He wasn't talking about those. He was going underneath all of that and talking about things that were more fundamental, it seemed to me.
Yes.
Yeah. So I started following him.
It's interesting thinking about, hearing you talk about taking the biblical story seriously, and that's like the big Peterson aha, that happened in the mid-aughts, was with his biblical lectures, was here's this guy, and obviously Jung, and Joseph Campbell, like that. It sounds like you were in that headspace during that time leading up to that. And I find all that so fascinating, because it was like all this energy being pent up, and it's like a match that lit, and just kind of, there was like kind of an explosion with all of that. And here we are. It feels like, I definitely, I think I commented on your, walking through Joseph, the story of Joseph as a narrative on Twitter, like yesterday, and taking these stories seriously. That's been a very big resonance for me in the last 5 to 7 years, because it was the story of Abraham, the kind of the climactic point with him and Isaac, that like it kind of changed my life. And it was a story stuck in my head from when I was, a kid. And that has just signaled to me the power that's there. And that the meaning that I found, like somehow subconsciously, it rose to the top. That wasn't a meaning that I had really ever even been taught. And so I'm really big into the value of story, and that, when Jordan Peterson was saying, the Western civilization is being basically held together by, a narrative structure. It's like, oh, what does that mean? And so you're like coming at this angle. I kind of wanted to ask you, or say this, I guess. It seems like with the 7 basic plots that you're kind of outlining, is that another guy's book that you're kind of going through, or is that your stuff? I couldn't.
I'll show you.
Okay.
So this is the book right here.
Okay.
This huge fat book. This was one of the books that I read at that little cafe during the pandemic.
It feels like that we're like humanity. When I was looking at this, like we're kind of stuck in 7 stories. like that's what we have almost. That's what it kind of made me think anyways. I don't know if that's the thought or not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I figured, okay, I got to start somewhere with this new story analysis. So why don't I start with the 7 basic plots? At least that's more expansive than just the hero's journey. If you think of the hero's journey as everyone's trying to fit all stories into this one template. And I said, well, let's start with 7, 7 archetypal plots. And then once I feel like I have those down, then I'll start tackling the biblical stories, something like that, just to try to get myself, sort of practiced in figuring out kind of like what makes each story tick. Like, why would the rags to riches story, for example, be told all over the place and all of these different iterations? And it kind of all have all these similar archetypal characters, similar plot structures, and similar life lessons, all across all these different cultures, So start with trying to understand that. And then, because the biblical stories in a way are so dense with meaning that you almost can't look directly into the light. It's like, especially by the time you get to the New Testament, everything is a reference to something else. Everything is a fulfillment of something else. It's just boom, 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 like so densely packed. So it's almost a little easier to kind of like stand back from it and then just look at little parts of it, or even use that more as a light to shine on the rest of the world, rather than looking straight into the light, something like that.
I mean, that kind of makes me think of Plato's Cave a little bit, but that's the other part of this, in this kind of space, is the Jonathan Peugeot influence that I'm picking up on. And I saw your engagement with him on the Monsterology stuff, but I'm a real novice getting into the symbolism kind of frame, like mindset. But a few weeks ago, my son is 7 years old, and I guess it was right before Christmas, a few weeks ago. You know how time is when you're getting older. I was like, hey, I'm gonna we're going to watch Indiana Jones. And so I popped on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it was like in an instant, he was completely captivated. And he had already watched some Star Wars. He knew who, Harrison Ford was or whatever. But the symbol of Indiana Jones, like, it didn't take any explanation for him to understand what he kind of represented right from the very beginning. And I feel like that is almost lost in our culture. There's, everything is stripped away, and the 80s is all this, it's so in your face. But I was struck by it because he said, that's what I want to be when I grow up. What does he do, Dad? Well, not all archaeologists are like that, but symbolism in film, that's a very, like I said, I think that's a very elementary view on it, but it was so striking to me that I could recognize in him how clear that was. And I don't think you get that very much in modern film in the same way, especially for kids. It's all ideology.
Well, I think that Jonathan has really helped me understand the idea of like a pattern to human experience that every once in a while needs to be reset. So you can think of it like if you read novels from the late 1800s, those novels are all deconstructing the stories back then, like Chekhov or Waiting for Godot, or even something like Moby Dick, which is, like the monster overcomes you instead of you overcoming the monster. Or even Frankenstein, where Dr. Frankenstein's the monster and the monster is just innocent, or, whatever is kind of like, it's already going on. This kind of like you have let's say the initial drop in the pond, and then you have one ripple out, which is a variation, and a farther ripple out, which is another variation. And then finally, by the time you get so far away from that initial drop in the pond, it's upside down or distorted, or, so like the original archetype is kind of been deconstructed so much that everyone is ready for a reset. And the reset is going to feel fresh. In fact, it might even feel edgy. Like, wow, this is really edgy. This is going right back to and that's because people forgot the original archetype, and there's something resonant, a theological term that I like to use is called the grooves of creation. And it's this idea that reality has these grooves in it, and you click into them. Oh, wow, things are kind of like, it just smooth here. It's going along, and you were going against it for a while, and then you click in, something like that. And that's why I think a lot of times these stories wind up being at the very outer edge, completely upside down. They click in, but like as an inversion of the original, something like that. Some kind of a relationship that we have between this map of stories or archetypes or something, and our lives, our anecdotal lives, and then they click in. So Jonathan really, really helped me understand that you don't have to follow the trends. You don't have to think, well, what's going to be the next thing? And as if it's like an endless infinity of possibilities that could happen in the future in terms of like for your success, like what kind of stories are people going to be into? What kind of a story should I write? Are Westerns going to come back? So you don't have to do that. Just go upstream and find the original archetype. That's a better way to find not only meaning for yourself, I think, but also if you wanted to be a professional storyteller, that's the approach. That's the proven approach, or the sure approach.
A couple of things falling back. It's like you were talking about the grooves, and maybe it was making me think of wrinkles in the brain, like, and that's like getting back into those. And it is, those things are developed through kind of process and repetition. And I think I was listening to something from him about, he was talking about suits. Let me see if I can nail this down, in fashion. And it was about the basic pattern. That's it. Finding the basic pattern. if you look at fashion, there's, oh, you were kind of hitting on this. Like, well, what's next? What's next? And let me find what the trend is going to be. And it's like, oh, big and baggy or fitted and thin, on those things. Like, no, just go to the basic pattern. And
Right.
I even see that represented in his own fashion. I felt like, but yeah, that's, what would be an example? Do you have an example of something that like in that you're kind of chewing on?
Of going back to the going upstream?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, well, two examples on it might be on a little bit more of a trivial level, but you can see how it works. In the 1920s, if you go back and watch films from the 20s, they're very avant-garde. You've got German Expressionism, and then there is an animation studio in New York. If you look it up, a Snow White version of an animated Snow White in the 1923 or something, or somewhere in there. And it's all weird. It's like the German Expressionist version of Snow White, like that kind of black and white, weird animation. And Walt Disney had gone to Europe. He had seen the castles. His imagination was captivated by old Europe. You can think of like old Europe is like the remains of a civilization that had been kind of like was under attack, and certainly like with the wars, kind of like almost an apocalypse of that civilization. And then out of the ashes of that, at least after the First World War, you could say, if you think of that as like an apocalypse of the old world, Walt Disney goes and sees the remnants of that in the castles and the kings and queens and knights and all that, and says, you know what, we're going to make our Snow White just the original version. We're just going to go ahead and tell the normal version of it. We're not going to do like Moby Dick, or we're not going to do like Frankenstein. We're not going to do like Waiting for Godot, or like Chekhov or something like that. We're just going to do the original version. And a lot of people think that was because they all did the original version back then, but that's not true. Like if you read novels from the 1800s, you'll see that this variation process was already well underway. And so that was, to me, is a example of a reset. Let's just reset it back to more or less the straightforward version. You might say the right side up version or something. And of course, what happened is it built this entire empire because it really resonates with people when you do that. The second one would be George Lucas with Star Wars in the 1970s. If you watch Easy Rider and you watch a lot of the kind of like the 1960s and 70s films, Midnight Cowboy and French Connection and Planet of the Apes. Although I guess Planet of the Apes you could say is a classic tragedy, but like kind of like people going kind of like, again, the variation, let's do minimalist storytelling, or let's do, and that can be interesting if you're a college student and you're like really want to engage, go and watch Clockwork Orange or something, or Stanley Kubrick, like you want to really kind of, but in terms of just the clear, fresh water of just the cleansing nature that story has, like with your son, seeing that archetypal hero and being inspired by it. It's not a complication of it. It's not an anti-hero version of it. It's not an inversion of it. It's not somebody else's take. Just here, it's a reset. That's really what Star Wars was, which I would say caused all of these kind of more straightforward stories to happen, from Zemeckis and Spielberg and all of those guys from USC. They were studying at USC kind of like almost the archetypal. They had discovered Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell, if for any way you might criticize him for his faults, was trying to go back upstream and recover that kind of original drop in the pond. And then what happened there? Again, a whole religion was created by that reset.
That's so fascinating for me. I said I was born in 85, but that really is the corpus of my imaginal formation. Was my grandma pirated some Star Wars films on VHS, and I was home, when my brother started kindergarten, and I was watching Star Wars, and it's all these images. I didn't understand what's going on, but the images got like very deep into my subconscious, and I've seen that, I understand that now, how powerful that is. And it's interesting because all that golden age, it feels like, looking back, it is magical. And I think with the trying to remake, like, we're in a season where everyone's trying to recapture that, but it's like grasping at the air because they're not going to the source material. They're trying to infuse other things into that. But that's an awesome perspective to kind of, that makes a lot of sense to me about.
Well, I think when the generation flips over, and the previous generation was mostly you might say like a variation generation, like the cool thing, let's say for the Beatles generation, was to be, against authority or whatever, like something like that, right? The children of that generation now, they're kind of like ready for a reset, because it's not going to feel stuffy. It's not going to feel stale to have the reset, because they never kind of got that. And so right now, with all of this talk about metamodernism, new sincerity, just all of this stuff kind of like bubbling under the surface, I like to sort of think that, like, if you kind of go away from the mainstream, let's say the mainstream media, and kind of go into like film festivals or, kind of little corners here and there, like perhaps this corner of the internet is one too, you're living a little bit in the future. Because I learned this from going to Sundance every year. You go to the Sundance Film Festival, and you will see what the whole rest of the country, or maybe even the whole rest of the world, what will be trending in a year or two. What kind of issues are going to go popular. But you see kind of like the beginning of it there. So, maybe I was more depressed about the state of storytelling and telling, a while back, because I saw it maybe already at the film festivals, and then it kind of went mainstream. But now, if I'm still kind of a little bit in the future, now I'm super hopeful, because that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing metamodernism. I'm seeing like the little corner of the internet. I'm seeing new sincerity. I'm seeing people, the surprising rebirth in the belief of God.
Right.
Like all of these things are kind of, so I'm like super positive, while everyone else is kind of in this negative space.
It has been, and the more I've been kind of connected the last couple of months, it's really increased my optimism, I think, as I've started participating in it and kind of pulled back on some other stuff I'm feeding myself. And I think the way I process what you're talking about, living in the future, is I was in I used to be in a modern worship leader. That was really my my specialization and my craft that I started back, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and kind of rode, because I was ahead of that in the South, at least. I kind of lived in the future on that, like you're saying. I was able to participate in that in a certain way that was more on the front end of that. And my wife always tells me, "Why are you always in the future? Why are you always like?" I think there is something to that, and I resonate with that in this space. It feels. I was telling her, we're going to the. You and I are both going to be at the world symbolic. So, yeah, and I was thinking about a couple of conferences I went to about 15 years ago that were about like liturgy in the church and stuff, and it feels, the size of it and the timing, it feels in a similar way, like, to that. And now, where we're at with the ultra trad people getting into church, like, Orthodoxy and Latin Mass and that kind of thing. And it doesn't surprise me, but you were hitting on the anti-authoritarian versus like appreciating like institution and authority. And there's a channel that I've kind of followed the last year or two, a young guy, he calls himself Redeemed Zoomer on YouTube. And he's all about kind of reclaiming historical Protestantism and the institutions and the real estate and the whole bit, because I think he's hungry for that institution that we all kind of like knocked over with our rock music and stuff. So I'm seeing that pattern as well from that side of things. That not the film side, but from that side of things. I think that makes sense. So on your documentary part, what is it? The spiritual
journey
of the is that what?
Yeah, there's a playlist on my channel.
Yes, that's the one I'm talking about.
That's basically the lectures for my documentary class.
Okay.
I started doing that just to have a little landing place for whenever I create a new lecture, I put it there.
Well, that one, I listened to the first one, The Quest, I think. And you went into something, this is a theme that's actually started to arise in these conversations. But the first part of that is confession. Could you talk a little bit about that? You talked about like the church fathers or the desert fathers. You talked about confession in documentaries that happen, and then like the psychological, the early psychologists Freud and Jung, and that. Could you unpack a little bit of that real quick? I thought that was incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, well, so I started doing this research because I was writing that little book. And in the field of theology and art, there's different ways that you can approach it. How do you want to theologically engage with this art form? And I just happened to find out, anecdotally, by seeing documentary premieres all over the years with a bunch of, film and theology students at the Sundance Film Festival and other film festivals or film festivals that I was in or whatever it was, where there would be this kind of healing aspect to the film. And so I started to make this distinction between, you might say, generative versus exploitative documentary filmmaking, where the subject of the documentary is better off after the documentary is made rather than worse off, kind of a thing. And because I was just really surprised to see documentaries about very, you might think, private or touchy or vulnerable subjects, things that had happened to them, things that had gone through that you wouldn't want to talk about in polite conversation. You wouldn't launch into this story at a cocktail party or something. Having this very personal information or vulnerable part of themselves put up on the screen, and rather than judgment, which is what you see in other mediums like social media, just piling on with the judgment, just low resolution attack, formation, mob sort of a thing. This was the opposite. It was all like support and love and empathy from the audience to the subjects. And I was like, what's going on? And then also the filmmakers would say, yeah, it was weird. It felt like the subject would say, this felt like therapy to me, and there's a sense that we need to work out our lives out loud. Like you can't. And so I started to research it, and I found that going back even to prior to the Middle Ages, there would be, let's say, a monk, and they would have a confessor, which would be kind of like today, where you'd say, "Oh, that's my analyst," or "That's my therapist," or something. But it was more than just that. It wasn't just a professional, kind of, oh, your hour's up, you got to go. This was a full relationship with a more spiritually mature mentor. And so this is, famously, Martin Luther would go into his confessor. They'd call him a confessor. That's the person you're confessing to, is the confessor. And the guy would say, "You're coming here too often. You're obsessing too much." That's a famous example, but that's kind of what it was. You'd have like someone who you could sort of work out your journey with, who has that authority and experience. And so I started looking into different like forms of therapy. There's this one guy named Kurt Thompson, and his whole method of therapy is based on this idea that we have this need to be known, and so he just tries to get to know the person, and in getting to know the person, we have this thing where you bounce off yourself, your authentic self, or you're honest about yourself with someone else, you'll know yourself more. So there's this kind of reciprocal self-knowing relationship. And the more you know yourself, it's really about self-deception versus self-authenticity, something like that. So I thought, well, it's interesting. You could almost put that as a genre of documentary film, the confessional documentary, where the power and meaning of that particular genre of documentary is modeling this relationship that the self has to the truth, something like that.
That, oh, truth. That is truth. That's the core of my story, and the turning point in my life was confession. Self-betrayal, betrayal of trust of my wife, betrayal of trust of people I pastored, betrayal of trust of my community. And that situation where I had this kind of experience where I saw Abraham's knife coming down onto Isaac, I was in the lowest point of my life and the deepest amount of emotional suffering that I'd ever found myself in. And that's where, am I going to confess the truth? Not, are all these things I believe true, but the truth, the reality of who I am, what I have done. And even as I've told that story in some other context, I would say, and I sat up from that moment and I wrote out a confession. That's what I say, literally. I wrote out a confession. And then it was a beginning from that point, which that was to my wife. And she said that she would meet me at the truth if I was willing to be truthful with her. I don't know if she knew what she was saying, but that is the power that I have found in healing, is to know myself, to be known. And that has happened through the practice and the continued practice of confession. And, you know, if you look, you're hitting on it with the church versus psychology. And the point that you made in that lecture that you did was that Jung and Freud actually wanted to see an army of confessors. Like you were saying, like that role in people's lives, you know, and you said they weren't even shying away from the fact that they even got that idea from the church. And it's so interesting now that it's such a secular vocation in that way. Luckily, I've had therapists that were Christians, and that was important to me because of to be known coming from a pastoral life. To have that understanding was important to me. But man, that has been the power of healing, and it's so interesting that you were able to parse that out of film. That was so fascinating to me. It's like, oh man, and yeah, that's like that was what I have found has been the most direct path to healing in my life, is that very thing. So whenever I listened to that, I like went and texted my therapist, and I was like, hey, thank you for being my confessor. You know, as playing a role in that. And yeah, I think even I was in another conversation in this space, and Chad the alcoholic on Friday Morning Nameless was saying he's reading Augustine's Confessions, and that is like what's going on. And he's in, you know, the AA space, and that's a huge part of that as well. And I don't know, man, that was all after I even reached out to connect with you. And I was just like, man, there's some deep stuff here that's making a lot of sense to me. So tell me more, like, how does that connect to your book? Is it, you know, truth that also came out, like filming truth, that title like jumped out at me.
Well, I basically, the book is going through the history of documentary film and showing, confession is one of those genres, but basically showing what I take to be the spiritual genres of documentary. They could apply to fiction film as well in some sense, but it just seems to, again, I think it's like the grooves of creation and like the clicking in that we're talking about. That's what happens with documentary a lot, is that they're using real anecdotes from real people's lives, and they'll click into this pattern. And that was why it was so fascinating to me, because Sundance at the time, I would say Sundance from 2010 to 2020, they wanted to be super edgy with their narrative films. You know, they wanted to have, they sort of prided themselves as being the anti-Hollywood. So that means not the happy ending, you know, not the, you know, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets back together. No, they never get back together, you know, and you have to sit with that. You know, that was kind of like their thing, you know. But the documentaries were so healing. And I was like, what's going on? What's the disconnect here? Like, when people are writing fiction, it's super depressing, but when they're doing nonfiction, it's hopeful. That's weird, you know? And so I basically said, okay, what if I so I started with confession, and I said, there's definitely a very, very clear idea of the art form functioning ritualistically, or at least modeling a ritualistic practice, like, you know, a periodic confession.
Yep.
I mean, you can have one-on-one confession, but then you could think of corporate confession as well. You know, like you have in a liturgy or something.
Yes.
And in the absence of our culture, you know, kind of bleeding out those ritualistic components, which I think are essential to a healthy human community, flourishing community. Well, usually who takes it up is the artist. They'll say, okay, well, here, I'm going to provide now this ritual that we lost, you know. So the spiritual genres are certain religious rituals that were picked. The mantle of passing those on was picked up by the documentarians, I argue. Confession, testimony, celebration, and lament. You know, these are all things that you would have had and still have in small forms, but not as much as you would have had. Like, if you lived in the height of Christendom, you'd have all of those things happening throughout the church calendar and in various religious ways, these rituals. And so I thought, Father, it was interesting that those rituals were kind of being acted out through these documentary films unconsciously, because they certainly were not trying. You know, the filmmakers just said, I want to tell a good story. I want to find an interesting thing to put in my film. Why would it match up to these things, you know?
Because they're true.
Yeah, the grooves. Yeah, the grooves.
So what is kind of you're talking about a little bit about worship and liturgy. What is your, how do you practice your faith? Where's that kind of land for you?
I'm basically there was a couple of Tim Keller church plants in LA, happening right when I moved to Pasadena to start at Fuller. So I started pretty much almost the first week of this church plant, which was part of Tim Keller's network. And I've been with them ever since. So PCA.
A buddy of mine I used to work with was a PCA pastor, and he was at a church plant in Long Beach, late, like 2010, 11.
Yeah. Same kind of time period. There's one in Santa Monica, Pasadena's where I go, Long Beach, Orange County. And they're city churches, like they're church plants within the city. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So he was out there. He grew up they had lived in Long Beach for a while, but we worked together in Arkansas for about he was here for almost 10 years. So it is a small little world. And he was very impacted by Keller during that time. And Keller was a real gift during the height of new atheism, I feel like, for the church. But do y'all practice corporate confession?
Yes. Yeah. That's in the liturgy. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I kind of had this very earth shattering thing and confession became such a visceral part of me, I was kind of like, we helped implement that at our church. We were kind of just your like normal bread and butter evangelical stuff. And when he came on, we added like basically a Presbyterian liturgy. And I remember kind of being frustrated with the confession of sin, because I was like, no, this needs to happen on the personal level. But I would go back now and say there needs to be like layers of that within our life, you know, and that is an important one that needs to be played out within the church and stuff. So yeah, man, I heard, well, actually, before we get to that point, I wanted to go back to the Monsterology. And this was a recent, Peugeot came out with the Leviathan video just a few days ago. And you made a thread on Twitter that just went on. Could you unpack what was so meaningful, how that connected to how that helped you? I'm interested in that.
Well, so Peugeot has been super influential with me in terms of understanding the archetypal creatures, you know. So like Campbell, Joseph Campbell will have, you know, the hero, the antagonist. What's the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist? You know, are they connected in some way? And then you have, you know, the mentor figure, the trickster, the fairy godmother type, you know, all that stuff. But then the monsters, you know, if you go back and watch my very first Overcoming the Monster lecture on during the 7 Basic Plots playlist, which is it's one of my most popular videos, I think, because people love Jaws and Jurassic Park and stuff, you know. And that was my first kind of attempt to try to understand what the monster is. And I was using subconsciously probably a lot of Peterson, but also consciously Jonathan Peugeot. But I really thought of the monster just like as one thing. And that's how Christopher Booker is too in the 7 Basic Plots of Overcoming the Monster. His version of the monster, I would say now, is primarily based on the Leviathan. You know, so you've got, you know, the thing that wants to eat you, you know, the shark in Jaws, the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, or zombies, like a horde, like a big horde of things that wants to eat. But anything that wants to eat you, that's the Leviathan. But then there's the giant, and then there's the snake. And I realized that maybe those monsters don't want to eat you yet. Maybe those monsters have different tactics, you know. So Jonathan did one about giants, a video about giants, which was very good. And then he did this one on Leviathan, and I just so happened to be working really hard on understanding the difference between the snake, the giant, and the Leviathan, and formulating a theory for my little Monsterology project to kind of like take the Overcoming the Monster plot that I started with and kind of like give it a little bit more variation, like more. What's the difference? What does a snake look like in a story versus what does a Leviathan look like? You know, the snake is really more about deception. And the Leviathan, by the time you meet the Leviathan, you're already on their turf. You're already far away from safety and home, like Sheriff Brody out on the water, and you're in and it's ready to eat you. But if that Leviathan maybe it's connected to the giant, the land monster, and then to the snake, the garden monster, you know, and it wants to lure. So the snake lures you out of the garden, and then the beast pulls you down into the salt water, and then the Leviathan eats you. Kind of like a little progression going on. So Jonathan is kind of like saying, I just thought it was confirming a little bit about what I was studying. And so that's why I was so excited about it.
Maybe you can help me understand, because the part I think when I was listening through, that was, my wife was asking me about, what are you going to talk to Justin about? And I was like, well, there's this thing about Christ being the snake. Could you help me understand that in this conversation? Or
well,
I don't.
That's again, like when you get to the biblical stories, again, it's like looking right at the light. It just gets so dense, you know. But you can think of it as, I think what people want to do is they want to say, okay, here's the story. Good, bad.
Right.
You know, snake is bad and evil, and whatever, God is good or something like that. But then at the same time, theologically, people say, well, we're not dualists. We don't believe in ultimate good, like God is ultimately good and evil is like Augustine will say it's a lack, or evil is only parasitic, or what. Okay, so that means that you can't say that the snake is evil incarnate. You have to say that the snake is something else. The snake has some relationship to this parasitic thing that we call evil, but is not evil itself. So then, when the snake is lifted up in the desert on the staff, they're like, well, what? That seems like a contradiction. Like at first the snake is poisonous, and the poison kind of like pulls them out of paradise, and now here they are in the desert, and now the snake is pulling them back into paradise in some sense. So and this is where I really get a lot of insight from Martin Shaw.
Okay, yeah.
Which is that stories don't deal with absolutes like that. They don't deal with good, bad. They're not black and white. They kind of like journey through, and sometimes there'll be an apparent contradiction, and it'll kind of like work on you. It goes like past your conscious way of trying to understand it and hits you on another level in some sense.
Yep.
And you can't categorize it. It's like and then the end of everything gets reconciled back together into oneness or wholeness, which includes the snake, weirdly enough. The world gets pulled apart, and it's all of these little elements get pulled apart, but then it gets reconciled all back together at some point. And so you find like the redeemed version of these things that you thought were evil itself, but in fact they were just corruptions. They were just parasitic, something like that. It's very hard to explain.
Well, the way it made sense to me was that I work in the medical field, and there's a lot of times in the symbols for healthcare, there's a snake wrapped around the cross, actually.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that, I guess, with Moses, it was a healing. If you looked at the staff, that you would be healed, and then that obviously we can point that to Christ. But yeah, the other thing it got me thinking about was that, yeah, evil's not the absolute. It actually kind of points to something. And I've heard Peugeot talk about gargoyles on old. Like, how does, that was always this dualistic thing that I was trying to, how does that make sense that those were on churches, but it's like trying to protect or battle the forces outside, as you go into this holy place. And yeah, they kind of, it points to something more than it is something, almost, I guess. And I've got to fix this thing.
Okay.
Man. So I guess the other, something I wanted to quiz you on is, are you familiar with Rankin and Bass?
No.
So Frosty the Snowman cartoon.
Oh, well, Rankin and Bass. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. Rankin and Bass. Okay, sorry. Yeah, that's my Arkansas coming out there. Or my musician. That smelled like bass. So they had a pretty profound impact on my psyche. I watched the Hobbit cartoon. They did a lot when I was a kid. Obviously, the Frosty the Snowman is very big in our culture, but then they also had like the Last Unicorn, and then they also one of the last things that their company did which was called Videocraft, by the way, which I thought was a very cool name for a company. Like, the craft of video, the last thing they did was Thundercats in the late 80s was a cartoon, and that was Rankin and Bass. Rankin and Bass. And they never shied away from the grotesque. And I feel like, you were talking about Walt Disney and then the iterations of Disney over the years. It's like the term Disneyfication, or, they kind of smooth out all the the wrinkles in a way. And I felt like especially like their iterations in fantasy, when I would show my kids The Hobbit, and every time it would get to the Gollum, they're like, "Dad, change this is so scary." It really gets deep. Like this monster gets deep into your subconscious. This image, and they do things with wrinkles in their animation. Like like the dwarves were not like happy and dopey and sleepy. They were they have these wrinkles, and I was listening to something recently about how Tolkien was very kind of opposed to. He probably could see the future of Disney, taking future Disneyfication of these stories, like kind of stripping back some of the odd and the grotesque in a way. And they, early on, you can still see the witch in the early, she was very kind of ugly, but then you fast forward to like Tangled in 2010. And even though there's like a very small little bit when the bad guy's like this kind of sexy character, there's not like a visual representation of the gross side of evil. And I don't know, that's something I pick up. Does that make sense to you? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think that Tolkien does a really good job of kind of like doing justice to the parasitic sort of notion of evil, like the orcs, like the idea of like the corrupted. There's the good version, and then the corrupted version is the same thing. It's just decayed. It's just and I think ugliness for us, that's what it is. Ugliness is decay. It's like when things are getting broken down or distorted, or we have an image of what it's supposed to look like, and then it doesn't fit the image. It doesn't, so that's why distortion in the human face is so evident to us. If the eyes are in the wrong place, or if the nose is in the wrong place, it's very unsettling. So that's definitely, I think, part of it. I mean, it depends on, of course, the age of the, the age of the kids. But yeah, I think Tolkien does a great job of that, and I love that little Hobbit. I watched that over and over when I was a kid. The little Hobbit animation. Yeah,
I love that. I didn't read The Hobbit as a kid, so when Jackson started putting out the new ones, though, I had such a ethos. I already had the ethos. It wasn't hard for me, and I had known that Lord of the Rings existed, but because of that film, I felt like I was able to just like jump right into everything that was going on.
And Jackson came from horror,
Yeah.
So there's a sense that sometimes the horror genre is a good way into some of these spiritual themes, because it's doing it's really exploring that, the evil side, the distorted side, the parasitic side, and sometimes it's easier to do it that way than it is to do it from the other direction, from the positive side. So I think Jackson, weirdly enough, was the perfect person to make those Lord of the Rings adaptations.
Yeah, I mean, those were incredible. What are your thoughts? Do you think that anything has happened like that in, what Lucas did, like a singular vision, just like such a singular focus on that, and Jackson kind of had the same thing. Like, have we seen anything like that again? Do you feel like?
Well, it's just harder now.
Yeah, the industry is different.
Yeah. I think it would be fair to say that the Lord of the Rings represents kind of like a high water mark in a way for what fantasy cinema could do, because he had the free reign to just straightforward, do those adaptations as creatively and as well as he could, and the technology had arrived to be able to do it, and if you took, for example, the Chronicles of Narnia, they never were able to make a believable version of it. There was the BBC version. There was a little animated one, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
I've watched both of those growing up.
Well, the BBC version, it's like, like if you were going to go by like just what we expect, quality you expect to see on screen, it's like paper mache rocks rolling down the hill and stuff. So then that takes away, obviously, your imagination can only carry you so far if the acting is bad, or the lighting is bad, or the camera work is bad. But they never were able to complete the Chronicles of Narnia because they didn't get the funding quick enough before the kids grew up. So they were never able to. I heard C.S. Lewis's stepson is kind of in charge of his estate, and I remember going to a book signing where he was there, and he was explaining, okay, we made Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now it needs to do well so we can get enough funding so we can finish the rest of them. But we're running out of time because the kids are growing up. And I thought, you haven't started on that stuff yet? You're not going to finish it,
That's the genius of Jackson doing them all at the same time.
Yeah.
And I guess Harry Potter kind of gets, but that's still kind of in that time when that was.
Well, Harry Potter too, that was perfect timing. That movie series is right up there with anything else that you can watch. Like if you wanted to binge watch something,
right?
It was the who's who of British acting. Very, very talented directors and writers, and then using the material from J.K. Rowling. That was another high watermark. And
culturally, everyone never grew out of Harry Potter at that time. It just did, because it was a story of an extended story of coming of age that everyone grew up with as well. That's right. I hadn't thought about the Narnia not being able to do that. It's like, well, this has to do well, so then we can do another one, so it has to do well, and all that kind of stuff.
And Lord of the Rings was before Facebook, so that was the moment when everyone started fighting with each other. Was social media, and so that's another reason why I would put that as a high water mark, because everyone could more or less be on the same page, and you didn't have this hypercritical online component that breaks things down. That sort of like analyzes everything to oblivion.
Yeah, the scene in The Matrix when Morpheus is like the high point of civilization, and it's basically like the late 90s, and that came back to me. I watched through all of ER a few years ago, and the television series. And the last scene is, I don't know if it was the last scene, but it was George Clooney and the guy who plays Mark. I can't remember his name. He was Goose on Top Gun, and it pans out. They're walking through Chicago, and it just pans out, and there's all these people, trench coats and stuff, and it's like literally the late 90s. But there no cell phones, but this huge skyscrapers. I was like, that reminds me of that point in The Matrix, like that. And here you are kind of talking about what film and cinema was able to do with the Lord of the Rings. That was all like happening right there at that point. And it's like, well, where are we at right now? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I wonder, there's just something like, it seems like every time we first get a technology, we misuse it, and it takes time for it to get redeemed in a way. And that's what's happening with the internet. It's like it takes time. Like people, I feel like people learn, okay, that was a mistake, eventually, but it takes, it's not easy. You can look at other technological innovations that have happened, like car culture, like the automobile, and go like, well, you can never go back to living in a small town where everybody walks and everybody knows their neighbor. It's just never going to happen. So then you have to work around it. And it's kind of like that with the internet. Well, you can never go back to everyone watching Seinfeld on Thursday night and talking about it and having a shared experience. It's all private individual experiences. So you can recognize it and say, let's try to mitigate the effects of it, but you can never go back,
Did you watch the ads on the Super Bowl this year?
Some of them, yeah. I fast forward through most of them, but
okay. I was so struck by how, like, the youngest actor was like Michael Cera, but like every commercial basically had a AAA act, or like huge actors in the commercials. It kind of spoke to me on the state of the industry, like that they're all doing commercial work and no one's barely even a millennial because of that point about sci-fi. Like, this was like, it felt like I was watching the end of the collective Seinfeld experience, like you said, because this is one of the only opportunities culturally where, and especially because of Taylor Swift this year, that almost everybody in a certain, it was a very shared experience, and that's so rare now. And here was like all these actors vying for just 30 seconds of time to get everybody watching them. It was that's what I noticed, at least when I was watching all the ads. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Ben Affleck's doing the Duncan with Jennifer Lopez. It was just like, what?
Yeah.
This is different. And I don't know. It signaled to me that it's changing or dying in a certain way like that.
That's true. Yeah, the massive movie star, the Arnold Schwarzeneggers and Tom Cruises of the world. Maybe that was a more of a 90s, early 2000s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s sort of thing. And I don't know if there'll be massive stars like that again.
Yeah, you have the Mr. Beasts he's one of the biggest YouTubers, that my kids and probably most of the kids at school could say there's some collective experience around something like that. Taylor Swift seems to be one of the last people.
Well, I saw Taylor, I worked on that Taylor Swift Eras tour.
Oh, cool.
Filming it. And so I was in that SoFi Stadium with 70,000 people, 4 nights, of that. And,
Wow.
And so I realized, it's not like we can't have big stars anymore, or we can't have all of what's crazy about it is when everybody's attention is focused in one place, the energy of that, everyone's attention being focused in one place. And it's everyone loves it. People don't really want to have all just private experiences that are tailored just for them. That's kind of like the weird, even with those little goggles now, it's like this idea of like everything is just you, and it's like, can I talk to you about the show that I'm watching? Well, no, I haven't started that yet. Don't spoil it for me. Like everyone's just having a private experience, and we need communal experiences.
Yeah.
We need common experiences.
And that's maybe part of the rise of religious practice and the whole idea of what is, the word Catholic meaning universal, like sharing that experience. That's one thing I find so, well, I'll back up. I mean, that I'm a little bit like, oh, you worked on that my girls, I've got a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old, and they did the movie because we didn't go to a concert, but they like it. They went and saw the film you worked on, and it allowed them to connect to this meta experience happening in the United States, and that was, I kind of was happy for it because of those very things that we're talking. I was, you can have all sorts of opinions about politics and blah blah blah, but it's like my kids were sharing in something, and it coincided with all the Facebook posts of friends dressing up and doing this thing, and that I felt like it was kind of like a blockbuster in that, like, oh, everyone, you got to make sure you get to do this, and it's sad because a lot of that is going away, and especially you pointed to especially with whatever Apple's going to do with these goggles, like, because Apple does Apple still. I think they're still able to do some of that spirit of Steve Jobs on this new product they're doing. But let me see. I had there was one other thing that I lost that was going on there. Well, I had heard that maybe you were thinking or possibly going to work on a TLC documentary. Is that true? Is that a real thing?
It's I have uh, I have about a 90-minute cut.
That's a lot of
But
that's a lot of cut.
it's super hard. Yeah. I I'm still sort of plugging away at it, but um it's very it's proven very difficult for me.
Can't
I
imagine.
thought I'd be, yeah, I'll put something together that's kind of fun to watch and kind of cool, that would kind of like introduce. It wasn't for about TLC so much as it was about the Estuary Project.
Mm.
And it was, John Van Donk was like, hey, you make a little something about the estuary that we can use. And so I'll probably, when I get the time, finish that as a shorter piece just about what the Estuary Project is that they can use to promote the estuary stuff. In terms of larger than that, it's very difficult to figure out. A documentary is like a kind of like a wider audience standalone thing, and the this corner of the internet is like this big river that just keeps flowing, and more stuff just keeps coming. And so what Paul does is perfect, because it's just, there's no editing, and he just puts it out, puts his thoughts out, comments on what's going on. And then the in-person kind of like gatherings, like the Symbolic World Summit or the festival in Germany or the Chino conference and stuff, that stuff is all kind of like bringing people together. And so where exactly a bigger video than just the one that I'm doing for about the Estuary Project would fit, you wouldn't want to work super, super hard on something, put in a bunch of hours, and then everyone just watches it just like they would watch one of Paul's stream of conscious videos. It's like, oh, it's not worth all that extra effort. So exactly where I would put a bigger project, I'm not sure yet exactly, but I will finish this one about estuary. But I don't know, I just thought, I don't know why, but I thought I could just knock it out, and I was like, yeah, I'll just do this. But it just was very difficult. It's still very difficult to get a handle on, like, just a little story to tell without going down 8 million rabbit holes that you've really,
Yeah.
I have to explain this, I would have to explain that.
Yeah, what is the
So,
narrative arc, I guess?
well, I decided that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the interview I did with Paul and use that as the backbone of it. And just as he tells the story, show examples of it. And that's it. Simplify it a lot,
Mm-hmm.
rather than try to introduce all these different people and then have to explain who they are and et cetera, and realize that if you want to go and watch some of these channels or explore some of these little enclaves that it's available to do, you can do that. So instead, I just decided to sort of pare it down. And so I started all over from scratch, a recut from scratch, using just Paul as the backbone of it. And I think that'll work.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask if you were going to be filming any next week.
I don't think I'm going to film next week. I think I'm just going to, for once in my life, not film something that I go to. And just kind of go with the flow and see what happens.
Cool.
Yeah. And also because, I think that the Symbolic World is a little bit different than estuary. And so it doesn't necessarily relate to that other piece that I'm making. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to not even going to bring a camera for once. I'm just going to see what it's like to go through life, not constantly documenting everything, and just see how it is.
Well, I look forward to meeting you in that embodied state. That'll be cool. Yeah, what are you most excited about for Symbolic World?
Well, Jonathan Shaw has been an absolute mind-blowing influence on me, what little I know about him. His way of engaging with story
Martin Shaw?
is sorry, Martin Shaw. His way of engaging with story is just incredible. So I'm looking forward to his talk. And then, what I've been noticing, like in terms of like what I've been sort of studying, is like Jonathan is doing one thing with the symbolism, and then Martin Shaw is kind of doing something with narrative and mythology. And then Father Stephen Damick and Andrew, let's see, Stephen DeYoung and Andrew Damick, the two guys that host the Lord of Spirits podcast, they're doing it with the biblical material, actually with the biblical material. So Stephen DeYoung is going to be there too. And so what I've been finding is that there's lots of different areas of people kind of working on similar ways of understanding the world, in this kind of like, you might say, re-enchantment phase of, if you're talking about living in the future, those guys are all living in the future.
Yeah.
In terms of the re-enchantment project.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just fascinating to see some of those guys coming together now. And because for me, it just opens up like all of the staleness of, let's say, reading the Bible, where you're like, I'm supposed to pretend I know what this means, but I have no idea what that means. You know, I have no idea, you know. And then every denomination has like a certain thing that they put on it. It's like, you know, if it's the PCA, like it's the doctrines of grace. It's like the gospel is everywhere. But like, what about the story? Like a little deeper than that, than just this is typological of Christ. You know, that's like, well, yes, I know that, but like, so what is? Can I go a little bit deeper? You know, you get in that kind of stale where you hit a wall. You know, you hit a wall, and you're like, okay, I already kind of know kind of what everyone that would preach a sermon on this, let's say, is going to say about that. But I feel like so then it feels boring, or it feels stale. It feels like, well, I already know what that, you know. And so what these guys are doing, it seems to me, is that they're cracking it open, and they're making it seem more like reading the Lord of the Rings. Reading the Bible is more like reading the Lord of the Rings, like where you want to know what happens next. You want to know how this fits with that. You know, you start to make connections in your mind, that sort of thing.
It's an interesting pairing with Jordan Peterson bringing a psychological perspective to Scripture, partnering that with narrative and story now. It is an exciting time, and that was my experience with the Abraham story I'd heard my whole life, seen cartoons about, and all these things. And it's like, and you would know this as a good Presbyterian, like, this is, you know, an image of Christ, and then God provides the lamb, and God could have resurrected Isaac, like, you know, and that's whole story gets like, you know, that's a big God wants child sacrifice. What kind of, you know, there's like. And then my experience with that was an experience that no one actually, even in the Reform circles, they were trying to like push away from this idea of like relating to the person of Abraham. It's like, no, where do we find Christ here? Like, let's not focus on the person. And I think that's a little piece of what you're hitting on, is these different ways of seeing the story and relating to the characters, not only a Christological kind of framework for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between, you know, using the story to kind of like prove a point. You know, like you have a point you want to make, and then you're like, for example, this story proves my point, you know, versus let's sit down and watch this movie. You know, that's different than, you know, so that you're kind of going through this experience. A lot of that just, you know, if you pair that with the like I was saying earlier, the loss of ritual, you know, the disappearing of ritual, and then, you know, not really having, for example, a seasonal or daily cycle, ritualistic cycle that you're going through, such as, you know, holidays and festivals and things.
Church calendar.
Yeah. If all that's kind of like gone, and then now also the story itself is kind of stale, you know, or reduced down to some kind of personal thing, you know, in the past, to get kind of a narrative, connected narrative, like as if the story is actually a story that progresses and not just a slices of different snippets that some redactor has put together, and this part of it has this political agenda, and that part of it has that political agenda, you know, between the North and the South, or something like that. that's been read for a long time. You know, in order to find that, I had to go to Jewish sources. I had to go to Robert Alter, this other guy named Fox, forget his first name, that would do commentaries on the Old Testament, and I could get a little bit more of a narrative sense of the stories, where they would read it as if it was written by one person, like as if it was had only one author rather than 5 authors, like the documentary hypothesis would hold, you know.
Okay.
Or just multiple authors over multiple centuries, all, you know, cobbled together. And so it just was so hard to find those sources over the years that would read it that way. And so Stephen DeYoung is doing an excellent job in his podcast and in his he went through Revelation. He's going through Genesis right now, where he's really just doing it like that. He's going through as if he's reading a story. And here's the first part. Here's the next act. Here's this character. Here's that character. Here's the complication. Here's the forces of antagonism. Here's what they're trying to accomplish, etc. And then what each little symbol in it means. And I have to say, I was like, you know, weirdly enough, you know, with all of that education that I had, I've never really had that with someone that had that amount of authority in terms of the degree, the PhD, you know. Yes, this is what that means. This is what that means. And here's how the story unfolds. So I think that that's super exciting because it's the same thing that draws you in, that created, for example, the Star Wars nerd community. You know, it's like everyone really, really into the story, you know.
Do you think that this is kind of downstream from that? Like, because so much in this space is sci-fi nerd type people, like, and that have deep value for not only the stories but the images because of cinema. And then now we're like retrograde, like looking at scripture, even though we don't have the images, and it's a different kind of narrative form. We're able to go back into that with these fresh eyes. I don't know, like and then it like is exciting, and it connects to this. Because my experience with Star Wars was, I'd mentioned my grandma gave me these tapes, and it was about 1990. And if you know, how old are you?
46.
Okay, so you maybe kind of got still some of the actual cultural hype when that happened. Mm-hmm. For me, that was long past, and I was in a rural country town where all that sci-fi stuff, you know, was not on anybody's radar. I was alone with it. I was alone with these images, with this story, and then I got come into this space, and it's like everybody like it makes sense to me. Like this space makes sense to me because of a lot of those things that we've even talked about in this podcast, and that it's now, as people are coming of age, it's like this is actually the future with our faith in a way. And I'm excited about it. And I'm excited that's kind of why I'm going to, I want to meet people, but I'm also going because I'm wanting to bring things back. Like I want to bring symbolic meaning and into my community, my little church, and help strengthen it for the future. And so I'm excited to be a part of that in that way, man. Well, I'm gonna kind of close this out here. I really appreciate your time and bringing your expertise to this corner and sharing about it. And hopefully it'll get more people to head over to Justin's Morning Coffee and see what you've got over there, and check out your book on Amazon. So I'm gonna give us another little video bumper, and then we'll end this thing backstage. All right, man.
Okay. Thanks, man.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.